Costa, we showed a picture of Nancy Pelosi earlier and was talking about her relationship with George W. Bush, a tough speaker from 2006 to 2010. I think most neutral observers would say one of the most effective, one of the most powerful, one of the most disciplined speakers in recent modern American political history. How does she stand? Any concerns going in to the floor vote, or does it seem like the Democrats, and I will just say it, are the Democrats going to do the smart thing, or are they going to do the wise thing and vote Nancy Pelosi as their next speaker?
Talking to House Democrats, they believe she is going to win the floor vote in January for Speaker of the House. She has the political control of her conference. The question is, Joe, can she lower the amount of people who are opposed to her at this moment? Can she make even a subtle guarantee to them that she's only going to serve 1 year or 2 years in the speakership? She's reluctant to do that. She's telling her top allies, why should I make any promise to these rabble-rousers? I have the support. I'm going to be the person dealing with President Trump. But there are a lot of tensions within this House Democratic ranks. You have not only those who really want to push for impeachment soon with President Trump early next year, but there are also the moderates who say we've just had enough with Leader Pelosi. And that's always going to be clouding her speakership next year, even if she's successful and really the dominant force in Democratic politics.
You know, over the past quarter century, Jonathan Lemire, Democrats have only controlled the House of Representatives for 4 years. They have had a miserable record. They have one of the best opportunities they've ever had to actually keep control for a while. It seems to me that they would want Nancy Pelosi there, helping them win re-election 2 years from now. But more importantly, as someone who's tough and someone who knows Donald Trump, that would seem to be the standoff, as you have suggested, the standoff, Trump and Pelosi, that they would want. They would want this woman in the room negotiating with Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's right. As Bob just said, there's going to be the balancing act on the Democrat side, trying to make that decision, how much to work with the president versus how much to try to stop him, impede him, and there will be the impeachment cloud. But from the White House perspective, as my colleagues and I at the AP wrote in recent days, the president himself has sort of looked at Nancy Pelosi as also perhaps the person he wants in that job. It's been sort of remarkable how he's almost openly campaigned for her on Twitter in recent weeks, suggesting that she deserves a speakership. And it's really a mix of two things. On one hand, he does genuinely respect her. He's told people around him that he thinks she's very tough. She's a fighter. She can get things done. He does feel like he can deal with her. We all remember, of course, that short-lived Chuck and Nancy scenario last year where they did make a couple of agreements. But more than that, he also sees her as a very useful foil, that he can make her in this next year, before there's an obvious front-runner in the presidential race, sort of the face of the Democratic Party. We know how unpopular she is among Republicans, that they use her as her image to fundraise all the time for their candidates, and that he feels that he can sort of vilify her, make her the enemy, use her. He's noted, he told one confidant who spoke to me, who said that he noticed that on the rally stage that mention of her name would draw some of the loudest boos of the night. And that's how we know how the president works best. He likes to have that enemy. He likes to have someone to run against. And he feels that with Pelosi, he can do a little bit of both. He can work with her at times, but also use her as somebody to attack at other times.
Well, Gene, running against Nancy Pelosi worked so well for House Republicans. They lost 40 seats, the greatest loss by House Republicans, running against Nancy Pelosi, the greatest loss they've endured since Watergate. And if you just look at the raw vote totals, the greatest midterm loss of all time by either political party, running against Nancy Pelosi actually damaged the Republican Party, because the Democrats actually did better in terms of vote totals in 2018 than the Tea Party did in 2010. Running against Nancy Pelosi, you can throw that in the dustbin of history. That does not work anymore.
Well, it sure didn't work this time. I mean, it really didn't, and it has been mentioned. I mean, she's the best fundraiser in the party. She's gonna, she'll have the party ready to keep the majority in 2020. You know, I'll just say that Democrats would be crazy to reject Nancy Pelosi as their leader just because they think Republicans are going to demonize her. Because guess what? They're going to demonize whoever the Democratic leader is. So it's not like there's going to be somebody and Republicans are, you know, they choose somebody else and Republicans will say, oh, okay, well, you know, that one's okay, really pretty good. It's never going to happen. So there's always going to be criticism from the other side. Democrats need to make the decision who's best to lead the caucus. And I've yet to hear a name of somebody who can do what Nancy Pelosi does, and you can't beat somebody with nobody. So I think she's going to be the next speaker.
There is nobody that can do what Nancy Pelosi does on the Democratic side, at least not now. Mike Barnicle, a lot of people are talking about Nancy Pelosi's ideology. Again, the results of 2018 have forever blown out of the water the suggestion that running against Nancy Pelosi is a smart political idea. But there's something more than that. And I'll quote, actually, Michael Dukakis here, that when you're Speaker of the House, this is where the Dukakis phrase comes in, it's about competence and not ideology. Ideology does not get you to 218 votes when there's only 175 people in your caucus that want to vote for a particular bill. It takes somebody that was born into this sort of political trading, like Nancy Pelosi. And again, there's nobody else in that caucus that comes close to being able to put the votes together, to put the coalitions together for like the Affordable Care Act that Nancy Pelosi can do.
Yeah, well, you're right, Joe. I mean, she is Nancy D'Alessandro, son of Tommy D'Alessandro, mayor of Baltimore. That's who she is when it comes to counting votes and pulling together enough votes to get herself reelected as Speaker or for whatever program she's trying to usher through the House. She knows her numbers. But Robert Costa, let me ask you in terms of ideology. Now, Trump and every other Republican makes a big deal of Nancy Pelosi, San Francisco, ultra-liberal and everything like that. But what is the threat level to her on her left among all the progressives who have been newly elected to the House, who are there for the first time, and who regard waving at Donald Trump as something wrong, taking a phone call from him as something bad? What's the threat level there to her?
It's significant, Mike, but it's not necessarily in power. What I mean is the committee chairmen who are going to really control the tone and scope of all the investigations, Jerry Nadler of New York, Adam Schiff of California, these are allies of likely Speaker Pelosi. And so you have her really having a grip over the committee chairman. What she has to keep an eye on are people like incoming New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and this social media savvy group of younger Democrats who find their political capital, their power outside of Washington.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.